I hope everyone had a great lunch. We're about to begin a discussion on sustainability. I'm Alex. I'm here as an undergrad student from Ryerson, representing my student association. We will now, I would like to introduce Lloyd Alter, who will be our moderator. He's an acclaimed design editor at treehugger.com and is a contributor including for MNN.com and The Guardian, among other outlets. He was previously an architect, developer, inventor, prefab promoter, and the president of the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario. He is now professor for sustainable design at Ryerson School of Interior Design. As our panelists come up, please join me in welcoming them.
Probably should have been on the other panel, but I'll keep complaining about bike lanes anyway, and cars and bike lanes, so it will be one seamless continuity between the two. In Ontario, about 40% of fossil fuels go into heating our buildings, and about 40% go into transportation, which essentially means people driving between the buildings. So transportation and urban form are really one issue, two sides of the same coin. The other 20% goes to industry, and which is mainly building buildings and making cars. So when you look at it, really almost our entire fossil fuel issue, our entire carbon dioxide issue is intimately involved with how we build our cities, how we run our cities, how we get around in our cities. Alex Steffen has written, there's a direct relationship between the kinds of places we live, the transportation choices we have, and how much we drive. He continues, we know that density reduces driving, we know we're capable of building dense neighborhoods, and even of using good design, infill development, and infrastructure investments to transform existing low-density neighborhoods into walkable, compact communities. One more paragraph of his. It is within our power to go much farther, to build whole metropolitan regions where the vast majority of residents live in communities that eliminate the need for daily driving and to make it possible for many people to live without private cars altogether. Yet, we fail to do this. We fail to make any significant changes at all. We fail to acknowledge that we have 12 years to cut our carbon emissions in half. I want to go around to each of you here and ask you to introduce yourself and to ask you if you have any immediate responses to my opening statement. Mike, start with you.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Layton. I'm the City Councillor for Ward 11, University Rosedale. Still seems a little odd to say that. This is in the middle of my ward. We're in the middle of my ward right now. It stretches from Dundas and Ossington to Bayview and St. Clair. It's one of the fastest growing wards in the city of Toronto, which I think speaks to what the kind of question we've been posed, the dilemma we've been posed in the city of Toronto. You know, I'm one of a handful of cyclists in the city of Toronto, and images like this infuriate me to no end. This is actually on my ride in to City Hall on a regular basis. And I think the only explanation for it is we've got a long way to go. And the cultural shift that needs to happen is enormous. I grew up on the back of a bicycle. I started cycling when I was quite young on city streets as a mode of transportation. My father, after my parents divorced, didn't own a car. So we biked around, and that was at a time when there were no bike lanes in the city of Toronto. And there were, like, to be honest, very few cyclists. That's changing, and that's changing dramatically. I don't know what's driving it. For me, it's the cost of driving and owning a car in the city. It's the frustration of sitting in traffic and having to commute and not being able to look at my smartphone or stop and enjoy and pick something up at a store easily. But it is changing, and that's what gives me hope that as we move forward and as there's a generational switch, to people that aren't putting home ownership and car ownership on the top of their success list and their to-do lists in life, and instead putting having value in the community and the life around them and time with their family rather than time in traffic. That's what's giving me hope, is that we are seeing this shift. And I just hope that to be part of that myself, as well as to raise 2 daughters as part of that and work in a career that allows me to help achieve that.
Sophia.
Okay, now that I think you can hear me better now. I'm Sonia Meek.
I'm sorry.
No problem. I'm Sonia Meek. I'm the Senior Manager of the Sustainable Neighborhoods Group at the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. So as a conservation authority that certainly looks at the view from an environmental perspective and watershed management, I think one of the positive things we have in Toronto is the legacy of the river valleys that have formed a set of great corridors for cycling and walking. And I know that what we do need are better connections through the communities that surround those corridors. And I think sometimes with, whether it be with cycling or with any other sustainability decisions, I think sometimes our own tendencies as humans we're our own worst enemy. It's easier to do things that we want to do as opposed to things we're told we should do. And so sometimes these right decisions are hard, and we need to create designs that make these corridors places that people want to go cycling. So just like we like to cycle through natural areas in the valley, having nice streetscapes that are inviting and safe is a challenge for us.
Don't feel that this is all a session about cycling. There's a lot more to urban sustainability, but Jason, you're...
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Jason Thorn. I'm the head of the Planning and Economic Development Department at the City of Hamilton. Hamilton people in the room? Anybody? Hey, all right, there's a couple. Good. So I guess reflecting on what you said, so planning and economic development at the City of Hamilton, I'm responsible for transportation planning. That's one of my divisions. But speaking as a planner myself, I've always believed that the best transportation plan you can have is a really good land use plan. And so my department's also in charge of land use planning. But one of the things I've realized working in Hamilton as we've started to sort of dig deeper and dive deeper into some of the issues that big cities face and growing cities face is that it's even much broader than that. So there is so much interconnectivity and dependencies within everything a city does that if you get one thing wrong, it doesn't matter if you get everything else right. So this, the photo behind us here is a parking enforcement issue. So the good news is I also am in charge of parking enforcement at the City of Hamilton. That has helped out a lot. My group also includes economic development and culture and arts and LRT and tourism and building. It's a very broad department of 800 people working across multiple disciplines, and I can tell you that as we've wrestled with issues of sustainability, of affordability, of equity, you need to have that kind of multidisciplinary approach to those sorts of issues, and that's sort of one of my big lessons learned in the role that I've been playing in the city.
Great.
Shannon.
Hello, everyone. I'm Shannon Holness, and I'm the Neighborhood and Environmental Improvements Coordinator at the Toronto Community Benefits Network. And what we do is we kind of respond to some of the larger scale infrastructure projects that are happening throughout the city or other municipal strategies such as Transform TO, and look at the ways in which equity can be considered in each of those processes or projects. And for the last year, we kind of spent time looking at the Transform TO strategy and figuring out how can this municipal strategy be integrated on a local scale, and like what that means for different communities. And what we found is that there are everyday instances of environmental stewardship that need to be promoted and prioritized and embraced and enhanced in order to have some of the outcomes that we want to realize towards sustainability in our society. And one of the other things is that we kind of try to look at is the ways in which climate change disproportionately impacts communities, and it can compound some of the challenges that more marginalized communities experience. So an image like this, it probably wouldn't make a difference in an inner suburban community where there is no real commitment to cycling infrastructure. And how do we navigate those types of challenges when we're building out our city and our city's networks and grids? So those are the types of things that we kind of look at and at the Toronto Community Benefits Network and through my role. So that's what I hope to speak to.
Yeah. Okay. Sonia, I'm actually going to ask you the first question, but again, I'm hoping everybody will pick up on the question. I remember 20 years ago or so, David Crombie telling me, well, he had just finished this big report where he looked at basically watersheds versus municipal boundaries. And he told me, really the edge of the watershed should be the edge of the community because everything depends on water, and that's the real geographic boundary of an area. When I originally said this hadn't happened, I was corrected by Chandra, who was originally going to be here and couldn't be here. In these times of ecological and environmental stress, this would seem to make more sense than ever, and yet it goes nowhere. What do you say to that?
Well, I definitely agree with David Crombie that watersheds are a really, really important management unit to guide the management of water and interdependent ecosystems. At the same time, municipal boundaries are equally important for purposes that they have, but so also are other systems. Broader systems like regional natural heritage systems, we need to think of how we manage those at that scale. And at another scale, the neighborhood and the community systems that work within neighborhoods, that's another very important scale. And to me, I don't think there's one perfect monster jurisdiction that should be the only boundary to manage everything. I think we have to recognize that we need to respect each of these systems and their boundaries and take wisdom from that and guidance from a sound understanding of those management systems. But the key is to integrate and to work together and bring our shared wisdom together and develop really integrated solutions at whatever scale. And I think there was another thing that David Crombie mentioned, and that is everything is connected to everything else, which I think is another reminder of the interdependencies of natural environment and built environment in these different units that we can, and I think Jason gave a good example of how important it is to understand the systems and how they interrelate.
Well, I think if I could, it's important to remember, though, that even when you have such a natural boundary for a system like the TRCA and conservation authorities, it can the systems that govern those can still be corrupted by money and power. We had, and it was well covered in, I think, the Star, with the recent election of the chair of the TRCA, that there was developer involvement. There was political involvement in the selection of the chair of an organization that determines where development and how close development will be to important water systems. And so it's that corruption of those decision-making bodies that we need to be really worried about. And at the core of that is money.
Right. Jason, do you have any thoughts?
No, I think I've also always been a believer in the idea of the watershed unit being a very strong planning unit, but there are other factors that come into play, and one I would look at, we are a post-amalgamation city. There may very soon be a bunch of other post-amalgamation cities. We've been at it for 20 years. It is very challenging and to get beyond just sort of the cultural and the heritage aspects of community. And I don't think that is something we want to get past. I don't think that's something we want to leave behind. Hamilton was amalgamated 20 years ago, but there's still very strong identification with Dundas, with Ancaster, with something like Westdale, which actually hasn't been its own community for a very, very long time. And I think any sort of, if we're talking, when we start to talk about political amalgamations again in this province, if we're talking about watershed scale planning, I don't think you can minimize that. I don't think that can be set aside, because that's something that's very powerful and important to people.
Shannon?
No.
Okay. It's all right. Well, I will ask you a question now, Shannon, and that is fundamentally that, you know, if you look at what's happening in Europe right now, in Australia, and almost everywhere but North America, young activists are taking to the streets, closing down schools, lying on bridges, taking climate extremely seriously, and basically taking charge. And yet, in North America, I've seen very, very little of this. And you and I talked briefly about sort of activism in Toronto, but I wanted to ask you, how do you see us energizing? How can we energize young people to take this issue more seriously than we do?
I think that I wouldn't start by saying that they aren't doing anything to begin with. I think that we do have instances of activism in the Canadian context, particularly when we're looking at the pipeline expansions that are happening, and they're really challenging the treaties that we have, or the unceded territories that we have across Canada, and the fact that folks are on the ground and they are protesting, and that is being stifled and kind of being rewritten by our government to consider, our federal government, to consider the ways in which it's good, those types of expansions are good for everyone. And it's not, if folks are having real challenges with it. So I think that to begin by saying that there isn't anything happening in Canada kind of adds to that type of narrative of it, that these types of investments in old, outdated infrastructure are going to be good for everyone when there is contestation on the ground, and again, just embracing and validating the things that happen on the ground that probably don't get taken up in these conversations around sustainability. So in our research, what we found when we went around to community hubs across the city of Toronto is that folks are engaged and they are interested in the conversation around climate action. Do they feel empowered? Probably not, and we have to kind of figure out ways to make sure that the things that they're doing around waste diversion and clothing swapping and wanting bicycles and bike shops and stuff in their communities, those are things that we kind of have to prioritize as well, and make sure that they're fully funded, and make sure that they don't go past, that they go past a seeding type of funding model, and past the pilot stage, and moving to more sustainable types of frameworks that can really leverage the work that's already being done and enhance it. So I wouldn't necessarily agree that nothing is happening. I think we don't necessarily embrace them or see them as valid. And it also has to do with the communities where these things happen. We went to communities that are considered neighborhood environmental improvement areas in the city to ask, what are you doing now and what resources are needed to sustain your work? And what they're doing now is really amazing stuff, and they're all local entry points. It's not going to look the same for every community just because of how inequity looks and how it's mapped across our city. So I think that we have to remember that these sustainability measures do have other ways to be realized in people's everyday lives, and we have to kind of figure out what that means on a local scale.
Well, Mike, you've been an activist since you could crawl. What are your thoughts about what's happening with this, with respect to this critical issue?
Well, actually, on Friday, I was out with the group at Nathan Phillips Square. It was a small but mighty group of youth that went on strike, I guess, on their Friday from school. I think that we'll see that number grow over time as it has in other parts of the world. I think there was an important point made, though, that there are pockets of activism that are just incredible. So I sit on the budget committee at City Council. We did 2 days of budget consultations across the city. By far, the two best organized groups were one from Regent Park, who you may have seen it in the stories. The youth just aren't getting the benefit of the new aquatic center as they feel they should. They're not represented in the enrollment. And they've discovered why. It's because if you don't know how to swim, you're probably not going to go and sign up for programs. And so you need those early interventions of youth swimming programs. And they were by far the best organized group of activists that came out and spoke. Much better organized than the climate folk, who have decades, I think that's my phone speaking to me, but decades of, Siri, decades of experience in the environmental movement, and yet these small group, community-based group is saying, we have a solution for this dilemma that we're facing. The other group are the community activists around the period person, ensuring there are free menstrual products in Toronto shelters. Like, these, again, are on-the-ground activists that might not, they're not storming the city by force with big signs up, but they have very targeted and very effective activism that actually, the two of the very few things that changed in the budget as a result of the budget committee, and trust me, I lost a lot of motions to keep transit free, or to keep transit fares from increasing, to increase investments in our ravines and litter collection in them, a whole list of things. But those were two of the things that got put on that list, and that's because of very effective community-led activists.
You would think so.
Yeah, I'd love to add to both of those comments, because I also disagree. I do think we see community leadership and activism, or just any kind of community leadership, but we also need to, I think, take a different lens. I'll just speak from the environmental sector. For many, many years, we've trotted out with environmental messaging, and we hold meetings labeled as "come to an environmental meeting," and you get 4 people showing up. We've been learning over the last decade we need to come out with a different message, and we need to go to where the leaders are, and we need to listen. So we need to start by understanding what are top of mind interests and concerns and values of the community leaders, and come to them instead of expecting that they're always going to come to us and our message. And I think if we start by understanding and listening to, whether it's your aquatic teenagers or whatever, let's first address their concerns and their interests, but in so doing, we can often reframe our message in a way that connects with them. And so we can help grow our collective network. And again, I'm back to my integrated, multifunctional programs and projects. I've been doing this now for a number of years, but we've been working with neighborhoods in communities, and we've been very successful at bringing multiple objectives, be it the community, the municipality, the conservation authority. We bring multiple objectives together in very integrated projects. And a lot of them are, in fact, the solutions are design solutions. They're green infrastructure integrated with buildings and lots and neighborhoods and other sorts of design solutions that accommodate everyone's interests. And I think that in that way, we can help gradually introduce people to the concept of climate, the need for climate action, but in a way that resonates with them and how it personally relates to them.
Any comments, Jason?
Yeah, I think there's a key element of this as well that I think is very important, especially for someone, I guess, wearing my hat as a bureaucrat, and that is how does the traditional role of the decision maker change in response to this? I'm actually doing a talk in a couple of months at it's called the Globe and Urban Futures Conference that has traditionally talked about big city building issues, and they're doing a whole stream this year on the changing role of leadership. And the talk I'm part of is about what is the role of the decision maker in the era of do-it-yourself urbanism, in the era of tactical urbanism. How do decision makers respond to that? It's particularly relevant to the Hamilton story, given that we're a medium-sized city. We're not a wealthy city. We can't afford to do all of the things that we know needs to be done for great city building, but at least we can find ways to get out of the way of those who can and those who will. And I think there's a fair bit of what we've been trying to do in Hamilton is really about trying to find ways to carefully and strategically and appropriately get out of the way of good things happening. And I'll just throw out one example, because before the session I was talking to somebody about this. It's not so much a sustainability issue, but it relates to our music sector. This was something that in Hamilton we have a very strong music sector. We see it as a real key part of our city's growth, of our identity, of our economic development. But again, we don't have millions of dollars to throw at the development of the music sector. And one of the key things they wanted was the sector wanted more places where they could perform and play in the city. So we said, okay, how can we, if we can't go out there and afford to build a whole bunch of venues at great expense to the taxpayer, what can we do to get out of the way of allowing those opportunities to happen? So we just sort of try to unravel some of the barriers that are in the way. We rezoned places of worship across the city that they could be performance venues. We changed our zoning and noise bylaws so that people could actually, God help us, play music on an outdoor patio at a restaurant without having it being a bylaw infraction. So these sorts of things didn't cost us anything. They were process and procedural things. They were untying restrictions on innovation that have just built up over the years and over the generations. At no cost to us, we can make some of these things happen. So I look at some of the activism happening right now around climate change, and part of it, of the solution, I think, is going to be how can decision makers get out of the way of those who are going to make change.
Mike, I'll start with you on this one. About 10% of the CO2 in Ontario comes from the manufacture of concrete. It's part of the chemistry of making concrete and part of the kilns that they heat the limestone in. And, cities all have grand plans for carbon reduction, and yet they allow sort of spiky zoning where you get high rises out of concrete in certain areas instead of spreading it out so you can get low rises, say, out of wood. They rebuild elevated concrete highways, and they put in concrete tunnels for subways instead of LRT. I mean, they talk climate change, but when you look at the individual components of climate change, they don't think about it in zoning, they don't think about it in transportation. It's not on anybody's radar. In London, they're talking about how the massive Crossrail subway, which is a great urban renewal project, actually is putting out 20 million tons of CO2 into the air, because at the time, nobody was thinking about, well, concrete and embodied carbon really matters. And yet we just keep pouring more concrete.
For fear that I may start to weep, I'm not going to talk about the LRT versus subway debate. In a couple months' time, we're going to get an updated report, very likely, that's going to give us a new number of what the cost might be in a new time frame. I will save my tears for that very occasion, because I have very little hope that we'll be able to get past the political divide that was very intentional in this debate. I think there's a couple reasons. One is when we're making any decision at the city, we're not looking at sort of the full life cycle cost. And it's very difficult to measure, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And if it's almost as easy as when we're looking at redoing maybe our ravines and the water, specifically the stormwater management component of the ravine. Are we looking at, as we do those projects, dealing with the ecological value and ensuring that we're enhancing that? Or when we're looking at our roads and rebuilding the storm sewer in our roads, why aren't we also looking at the permeability of the paving that goes into it? We're not looking upstream at some of those solutions as much as we should. Like good bureaucrats will say, well, what about these ideas? And a great example is when the City of Toronto started to give incentives for people to replace high-flow toilets with low-flow toilets. Seems very, very logical now, but 30 years ago, 20 years ago when we started doing that, it was a fight to get that investment. And that is the reason why we didn't have to spend billions in increasing our water capacity in Toronto, and in fact are now selling it to other regions because we've reduced the water consumption so much. But I think a lot of it has to do and then the other side, around the buildings, there's some practical reasons why the mid-rise buildings are still taking concrete forms. There is an entrenched desire to protect the yellow belt in the city of Toronto from development, and instead focusing it in very intense ways on some communities. I represent many of these communities in Toronto, Yorkville being one of the fastest growing ones. They're both technical but also these perceived ones that we need to protect low density neighborhoods from any type of increase including in some cases laneway housing or making duplexes and triplexes. There is that entrenched feeling, I think, amongst many in those communities, but also outside of the downtown core. Many of those councillors don't even want to have a discussion about rooming houses in their neighborhoods, even though they know they exist illegally and their lives are being put at risk because they're not regulating them. They don't even want to have that dialogue.
Yeah. Just on the infrastructure, I think aging infrastructure in the city in itself is an incredible looming threat. And it's only exacerbated by changing climate. But we can also think of it as an opportunity. And I think we've got some really great examples of where TRCA has been working with our municipal partners to piggyback on planned infrastructure renewal projects and use those that are already, there's a budget planned for them, but use that as an opportunity to leverage that planned project, that planned budget, and incorporate multiple other design functions. So you were giving an example, maybe relook at the materials, so don't just replace the same with the same. Opportunity to improve use of more renewable, sustainable materials, but also opportunity to incorporate other design objectives that can achieve greater environmental function and community amenities. So bit by bit, we can use every opportunity to build that sustainable future.
Shannon, do you have a thought? Yes.
Yeah, I have several thoughts. The first one is around, alternative materials probably going through a different process and that making it a bit more difficult, to kind of use those alternative materials. One example would be hempcrete. People are super skeptical about the outputs for that in terms of creating a strong structure, but it is an alternative material that has amazing insulation values. That's something I learned from a stakeholder when we were doing our stakeholder mapping project on low carbon building skills and what's needed for the future. So I think that, when we're talking about these buildings, we're also talking about retrofitting them. And I think that the TRCA had came up a lot in our research because of the tower renewal projects and the recipe for community projects and the way that the TRCA has collaborated with the city to kind of work on the local scale to get residents enhance their capacity to support some of the changes that will happen to their building as they are becoming more energy efficient. So learning about thermostats, learning about how to keeping your lights off and not opening your windows for long periods of time, things like that to keep your building healthy and safe and to last longer. Those are interventions that have to be made at a local scale to ensure that we're getting the most out of our buildings so that they can last longer. And the other part of it is one of the questions we had for our low carbon mapping project in the construction trades is what types of skills are needed to respond to these changes that need to be made to our physical infrastructure throughout the city. And we found that there is a little bit of contestation depending on who you're speaking to, that the construction trades do need to get different types of skills in order to participate on these projects. However, you do have folks, and that's what kind of came from architects and engineers and stuff. They have these kind of big, huge plans for how to make a building green and safe and healthy. However, they feel like as it goes down the project pipeline to the construction trade workers that things aren't necessarily getting done properly. But when you speak to somebody who's an insulator, right, they're going to be like, well, I do this all day long. How could you tell me I don't have the skills to participate on these projects? So there's a lot of knowledge sharing that needs to happen and collaboration that needs to happen. And we need to start looking at unusual stakeholders when we're talking about these types of challenges that we're having to the physical infrastructure of our buildings and what is needed in terms of alternative materials or different ways to build our buildings that we aren't continuing to harm the planet while we are while we're creating these much needed buildings, much needed assets that can help us move forward. So those are a couple of things. And then also the thing about not replacing things with like parts. in the Condo Act right now, there is a stipulation that says that you have to use reserve funding to replace like parts in buildings. And what if that part is no longer considered energy efficient? How do we update our Condo Act provisions so that we can make those types of interventions in our buildings and add to the lifespan of our building systems, right? I think those are all things that kind of have to be brought up. Skills, the parts we're using, and then having municipal processes that embrace alternative materials. Those are all things that kind of need to happen in order for us to kind of address some of the bigger challenges you're asking about.
Jason, any thoughts? No?
Just very briefly, because I think you hit on a number of sort of the very key things that can be done through just good building engineering to address sustainability. There was one kernel of good news, I think, that this government brought out in their fall economic statement that I don't think got a heck of a lot of attention, but I'm optimistic about the impact it may have, and that's the harmonization of building codes across the country.
Yeah.
And I think that has been a significant problem for a number of reasons. I think sustainability has been particularly held back by this disjointed framework of each province having their own building code. And one of them is just, it delays the implementation innovation. So by the time the national building code changes to integrate any number of the things that you just mentioned, by the time that trickles down into changes into a provincial building code, which trickles down through transition provisions into the implementation of issuance of building permits, which trickles down again into the actual construction of a project in accordance with those new standards, it can be a decade. It can be a decade from the date of consensus around a good innovative aspect of building engineering to actually seeing a building built with that applied can be a decade. So I think that's one element of the of what's being talked about. There were a lot of good news in the recent provincial announcements, but there's one that I think will actually have some positive impact on sustainability.
Given the time, I'm actually going to go to my last question. That goes back to something Alex Steffen wrote that I said that, we know what to do. And I've just put up this picture of Vienna where they show that they know exactly what to do. They build everything at about 7 stories high. They don't even allow single-family housing. When they plan a new development, they ram the LRT out to it and the bicycle lanes out to it before the construction even starts. They build everything to passive house, almost passive house, super high energy efficiency standards. And they have about half of the units in every building are social housing owned by the government and leased to people on sort of 3 different levels of economics. The one that's total subsidy, one that is a sort of buy-in to rent-to-buy system, and one that is an actual straight ownership. And you get this even context through all of Vienna that basically, this I took a lot of because I thought it was the highest quality building that I saw, but they're all like this. This is just how they build. And if you go to Munich, this is how they build. And wherever I've been in that part of Europe, that's what I've seen. They have basically made the decision that this is what they want to do. Yet all of us here who fight for sustainability, we've known what to do for years, and instead the Americans get Donald Trump, and we get Doug Ford, and we get Denzel Min Wong, and we get probably Scheer coming up the way in Ottawa, and the population out there would rather save 10 cents in a gallon of gas than have a carbon tax that might actually do something. This is where I get so completely frustrated that the key to building sustainable cities has nothing to do with buildings, it has nothing to do with bicycles, and it has everything to do with the jerks we put into power. So my question is, it's got to be a cultural change. And how do we do that? Because they're the impediment to Vision Zero. They're the impediment to dense housing. How do we change the culture?
You looking at me for an answer there? Can I make a comment on the photo first?
Yes.
And this isn't anything against the photo because it's a beautiful building, an example of mid-rise development. And I will say that Liberty Village was zoned to about this level of density, but instead the development sector in their infinite wisdom said, let's build these cheap townhomes first, and then we can save all that density and take all that money and build the rest in tall buildings, which is why we ended up with the form that they have there. But did you notice that all the cars are parked in the opposite direction? So this road's closed. because all the bikes are in the middle of the street, but those parked cars are actually turned the other way. So something's going on behind the scenes in this.
I was part of the big tour.
Were you? Okay. Because you're going those cars are coming the opposite way, and there's no yellow line, which I don't understand, but I'm not a big driver, so I don't know if that's normal or not. One thing, and it's who we elect to power, and a lot of it is about power, right? Unless there's someone in this room, and there might be one or two that have access to a giant billboard, an editorial board at a major newspaper, or the ability to print to pay $50,000 for a full-page ad in the Globe and Mail or Toronto Star, then we don't have a ton of access. I don't have that kind of power. We are at a disadvantage to those that do. And those that do have a clear motive. It's enriching themselves and maintaining their position of power. And unless we're prepared to do something about that, unless we're prepared to mobilize either on campaigns to install one particular bike lane, like we did on Bloor Street just a couple years ago, or en masse to change the way parties view their policy and which party leaders and governments we then elect, then we're gonna stay in this position. So we have to figure out what power we have, and we have it through our educations. I'm a planner from York. You didn't invite York, apparently, but I'm a planner from York, using our networks, using our time, using our expertise to advance movements, whether it's, again, for one bike lane or one ravine or ensuring that one particular infrastructure project has community benefits associated with it, but then growing our involvement in trying to change sectors, in trying to change the way politics happen. It does take effort, and it takes more than clicking like on a tweet or throwing a picture up on Instagram about your disapproval over a government, and getting involved in making those changes happen on the ground through social movements or through political movements, by getting involved in campaigns, by helping elect the leaders that you want to see in power. And it needs to happen on every level of government, as we've seen over the past years in every level of government in Ontario. There are some governments that are willing to do things like close coal plants and propose things like universal childcare, and there are some governments that will do the exact opposite and enrich their friends.
I think part of the solution is that we need to build more capacity in community leadership and the grassroots that will speak to their elected, make informed voting decisions, but also support their elected leaders and give them guidance on what decisions they would prefer be made. And I think part of our problem, and I'll kind of draw on something, a comment I made earlier, I think those of us who've been working and are passionate about the environment and sustainability, we've tended to speak to the converted, and we've tended to hold meetings with people who think like we do, and we're preaching to the choir, so to speak. And so I'll just share an example. One of our strategies in the neighborhood program that I deliver is to go into those neighborhoods and get past, we love those same 4 people that show up at the meeting, but we're trying to get past them and find out who else is in that neighborhood and what are their values and interests. And an example is in a suburban Brampton neighborhood. People have been living there for 30 years. Initially, we did intercept surveys, person on the street, to really figure out, we found there's absolutely no local social network. There's no one common church or school or community group that they belong to. But we found out something they were interested in. There's some low maintenance landscaping, so we brought in started holding a few little meetings, and we started getting people coming out repeatedly, and they said they were coming out because they said, "You're the first group that's organized a meeting in our neighborhood." And I actually met my neighbor, who I've lived beside for 30 years. I've never met them, but I like coming to these meetings because I'm meeting my neighbors. And so we couldn't afford to hold fancy workshops all the time, so we did coffee nights at the local Tim Hortons. We started getting people coming. Their passion was to meet their neighbors and develop a sense of community. Over 2 years now, they have now formed a community group They are now leading their own festivals. They're now leading, they've fundraised and they're leading climate actions, and they're calling up their councillor. And in fact, their councillor loves this because he has now support and a voice. And so I think it's these little steps of, as environmentalists and sustainability people, we have to stop preaching to the converted, and we need to stop and listen to what are top of mind interests of other people, whether they be business interests or other. And we need to respect everyone. We all have a purpose, but let's learn to bring our causes together.
Jason, thoughts?
Yeah, so I think I'll speak a bit in defense of politicians, because I work with a lot of them, and I got to say that there's got to be no more difficult job in the world than being an elected official. You couldn't pay me enough to do it. They don't. It is a very challenging role, and I would disagree with an argument that suggests that the reason everything we know and that we should be doing in cities, the things that aren't happening, are somehow just because politicians aren't there, or that politicians are in the way. I could say, I look at photos like this, I look at great neighborhoods that I see in other cities and think about the barriers that there are to making those things a reality. Yes, sometimes it's politics, but quite often it's not. Quite often it lies within our engineering standards, our zoning standards. It can lie within a recalcitrant bureaucracy. It can lie in all sorts of different places. I think, yes, it is all about positions of power, but I think those positions of power sometimes exist in some very obscure places in the decision-making process. You can have, for many things, you can have 99 things going in the right direction, but you've got that one thing that's not, and the whole initiative can collapse, and nothing will happen. And that is, it's not good enough to have great progressive planning. That on its own is not enough. You've got to have your engineering aligned, your transportation planning aligned. You've got to have your politics aligned. And even if all that's going in the right direction, if your public's not there, then again, nothing's going to happen. I know I came from an activist background myself. That was the first 10 years of my career. And I've learned so much about activism from being a non-activist in terms of what actually makes for successful activism. And I can tell you that I get very frustrated when I see activists who I agree with, and I believe and I agree with the points they're trying to make, tear the shreds off a politician on social media one week and then wonder the next week why they can't get that same politician on side for a different initiative. I see that time and time again. I think that if we just try to make the cop-out, make the excuse to say, well, nothing great is going to happen because we elect the wrong people and it's terrible politicians, I think we're letting ourselves off too easy. I think there's a great deal that can be done whether the politicians are there or not, and I think there's a great deal that can be done whether you're a bureaucrat or an activist to build a public constituency for the kinds of initiatives that we're trying to advance.
Shannon?
How do we change the culture? I went to a conference on talking climate, and it was all about climate communications. And I have a cheat sheet here from the conference, so I'm gonna cheat as I share a little bit of the key messaging that they spoke about. But one of the on a high level, one of the pieces of communication that really found resonance amongst any type of group, conservative or left of center or far left, was talking about transition in a way that embraced the fact that we have work to do, and it gives it a timeline, and it demonstrates the ways in which folks can all participate, and gives people kind of an action plan. And I think that the word transition is something that folks kind of need to hear and understand, and also understand how they can realize their role in that aspect of the sustainability frameworks that we need to be moving forward with. So I would say that we have to figure out messaging that isn't alienating. We have to do things that bring everybody in. We have to localize all of the entry points to climate action and climate work. And we have to do things that prioritize equity and the different ways in which climate action can contribute to increased community well-being, increased social wealth, community wealth, and then also reducing our greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, I want to apologize to everyone who came here thinking we were all going to talk about buildings and planning and got into all of this talking about politics and motivation, because after years of writing about building and planning, we end up bashing our heads against this issue so often. So we've got a few minutes. If there are any questions out there for people who want to discuss any of these issues or the ones you think that we should have talked about and didn't, please.
Hi. So just speaking to how difficult it is to actually even get to your local or regional elected official. So there were two things. Jason, you talked about the do-it-yourself and how to get out of the way. And I know for a fact that I've been part of a community group that was trying to offer free solutions to the city, and the city declined to come to the table, a free solution. And also myself, I've been trying to advocate for accessibility and getting on. The only way to do that is by being part of ACAT, which is the short for the TTC Accessible Committee, and it's really harder to get on that than to be elected official. So can anybody in the room give me an idea as to, with what we have right now, as to how someone like myself, who does not have an incorporated charity, can get our voices heard?
Well, I would start, I don't know what part of town that you live in, but we're, like, certainly in my office, and I know there are other councillors like me, many in fact are, even those that we won't name as being, that I might stand in opposition to, that will meet with local residents just on just about any issue. I don't know if you tried reaching out directly to their office rather than through the city. If they won't, then I guess I'll apologize on their behalf, or on councillors' behalf in general. But also to enter into leadership positions around some of those organizations that may be already advocating. It's my understanding that the Accessibility Advisory Committee, it's very institutional. Let me give an example, and I'll use, and I hate to bring up cycling again, but that's a passion of mine. So the Cycling Committee at the City of Toronto had been functional for about 25 years. Prior to that, this is when I took office in 2010. Prior to that, it wasn't an institutional body. And when it became institutional and the selection was being done by the city of individuals to sit on that advisory body, by the time it was Mayor Ford did away with it, the cycling committee was saying, you know what, that's not such a big deal because it was really ineffectual. And then what I did was we restarted it as an arm's length to City Council and kind of run by cyclists to advance their advocacy efforts within that administration. And all I was doing was trying to be a mouthpiece for it and give some organizational support. Then all of a sudden, people saw value in it again because we were commenting on stuff in a way that the previous committee wouldn't have done. We were getting involved in other committees, in economic development, in the Toronto Parking Authority, in infrastructure and bike lanes, yeah, but in other aspects of education and safety that the snow clearing, new snow clearing standards for bike lanes were a result about that, previous picture notwithstanding, that it was actually doing something again. So I wouldn't say that it's only valid to be part of an institutional advisory panel, but that there are other groups out there that are challenging the institution of government to take the bigger leap. TTC riders are, I think, a great example. We meet with them regularly on their ongoing campaign around fares and the fare pass implementation, as well as the fare increase that's probably going to be supported by council in about 4 days. So there are other avenues. I would just do what you can to join that movement, because part of joining movements is part of us as a community of supporters, building up power in a way that can take on the established power that exists at City Hall or any level of government.
Does anyone else have any other ideas?
The only thing I might add is that, and this kind of goes back to my earlier point, that I think the holy grail of this is how can we create a system where good ideas don't have to flow through City Hall first before they become a reality. And there's obviously obvious limitations to that, but how can you create a system where just a group of neighbors who are not organized, who are not a registered charity, not incorporated, not a subcommittee of any sort of official body, can make interesting things happen in their city or in their neighborhood without the rules and the procedures and the policies getting in the way? And I'm going to throw one more example. It's not exactly a neighborhood example, but City of Hamilton, like every other city, we really want to animate our commercial streets, our older commercial areas where we have our business improvement areas, create much more vibrancy on the street. So we invest in things like street trees and landscaping and street furniture. And yet when a business owner wants to put a bench out in front of their store, we require them to come to City Hall and get an encroachment agreement for putting something into the public realm, and we charge them a fee for that. That doesn't make any sense. So we changed that to remove that requirement. So instead of charging someone $300 for an encroachment agreement to put a fruit stand on the sidewalk, which is exactly what we want them to do, we want there to be this sort of animation of the public realm. So it's trying to identify some of those sorts of things that sometimes stand in the way of good ideas. And I sort of look at planning and zoning kind of the same way. Can you create a zoning framework that means when someone's trying to do something that you want to see happen in your city, they shouldn't have to come to City Hall for permission first. It shouldn't take going through a rezoning initiative to build the kind of thing that we would all agree at the front end is the kind of thing we want to see. Why put them through the process? And quite often we're only putting them through the process to protect for some other ancillary issues. So I think we've got to look at some of our regulations and standards through that lens of where does it make sense to try to get out of the way and allow citizens to do interesting things in their neighborhoods.
We're really running out of time, so can anybody else have a question? We've got one at the back there, got one there.
Hi, thank you very much.
Sorry, we didn't get to my smart cities question, if you're going to ask about that.
Oh no, we're not going to follow smart cities. But thank you for your time to be here to talk about sustainability, and I think right now it's a perfect time for cities in general to start talking, implementing, identifying sustainable infrastructures and how to implement them. But one of the things that I do think that this should be more focused is when implementing sustainability in the city, we should talk about affordability and social justice. So for example, we have recent news on renovictions where people are doing tower renewals or renovating their sites, but in doing so, they're raising the rent and evicting people that are living in those places. So how do, in your position, in your own city as well, to implement sustainability goals in building renewals or other strategies, but at the same time, advocating for affordability so that we don't marginalize low income and other less unfortunate people as well? Would it be in a policy or would it be social activism?
So I can kind of respond to your question. One of the misconceptions about tower renewal is that it would impact someone's rent. The fact of the matter is what are they called? The utility companies like Enbridge and Toronto Hydro, when they are supporting these projects, there is actually a clause in there that says that these cannot impact the rents that are associated with the units, right? So if a landlord does do that, they're actually going out of bounds with their agreement with the utility company who is providing the service, because so there is those type of things, but then there's also like some really challenging things that we have to realize is that these things aren't inexpensive to achieve. And there are some ways that landlords are, I'm not sticking up for landlords. My housing was condemned in 2016, so I know what it's like to lose your housing and be displaced. So I'm not standing up for landlords, but I do believe that there is something to be said for the fact that landlords are seeking like shared cost systems with residents, so that when they are kind of making these investments into the buildings, that residents can also enjoy the paybacks later from those types of investments, but also understand that there is a little bit of a cost up front that has to be taken care of. And unfortunately, we are not in a context where there's rent control anymore, things like that. But I think that if a landlord is increasing rents based on projects done by Toronto Hydro or Enbridge, for example. They're kind of going out of their way to do that, and the other challenge is that these utility companies are agnostic. They'll never say, hey, we did give money to your landlord to do this. They're not allowed to do that. But if you were to call and inquire about if rents are allowed to be increased or any cost be levied to residents, then it shouldn't be a thing that happens.
Maybe I'll jump in, and I think that's a really important question that you've asked, and it's another reason why we need to approach these projects by looking at all perspectives. And I think just as much as there can be the risk of negative impacts, there can also be the opportunity of a lot of positive impacts. And so a lot of elements of sustainable design, like green infrastructure and incorporating natural features in building design and placemaking, it can have tremendous social co-benefits and other economic benefits. Access to nature, tons of examples of how it's great in terms of stress relief, mental health, incentives for more outdoor active living. And I think some of the other studies are showing, there's increased market value of buildings that have incorporated it. For commercial rents can be higher, a greater sense of employee benefits, but also I think the city, their residential and commercial zoning, their RAC bylaw is a great tool now that's we can incorporate other economic opportunities in a space. So there's a lot of different tools, but it's an excellent reminder. We need to be looking at all angles.
I think if I may just add one thing around us ensuring that the sustainability of the community isn't just an environmental one, it's an economic one, it's a social justice one. And in particular, we've got to build a better mix of housing, a better mix of employment opportunities, so that people can live and work in the same space. Money is driving the Hilchansky maps of transit and income. Right? It's no surprise that people with wealth can live close to subway lines, and so that they can benefit from that infrastructure more than those that don't have that access because they can't afford that housing. So we need to, as our city grows, have more housing, have more control over the mix of housing and who it's serving. Part of that means things like inclusionary zoning and ensuring that every new development, as a neighborhood gentrifies, includes some middle income, some lower income housing, some supportive housing, so that range of society can exist and live in the same place and benefit from the changes that we make to neighborhoods to make them more environmentally sustainable at the same time.
Well, we have to clear the room, clear the stage for Mark Sterling. So I want to thank all the panelists, thank everyone who's here, and thank all of you. And sorry we don't have another couple of hours to keep talking. Nice meeting you in person, friend.
So thank you so much to Lloyd and all our wonderful panelists for taking out the time to be here today. There's no doubt about the importance of sustainability to our future and all the things that it entails. Thank you so much for all your questions. Unfortunately, we didn't really have time for too many questions this time around. And it is time for our keynote speaker. So if I can ask all the panelists to step up to your right. We have a few tokens of appreciation for you guys. Now to speak about our keynote speaker. Mark Sterling is an award-winning architect, urban designer, and professional land use planner, and the director of the Master of Urban Design program at the University of Toronto's John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design. Please join me in welcoming Mark to the stage so he can take it on from here. Yeah, you can either take the keyboard or there's a clicker.
Okay, I'll use them both. Okay, thanks. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for sticking around and participating in this really interesting morning and afternoon session. I can see from the way this thing is displaying up here, I may have some graphic issues as we go forward, but we'll see. There's supposed to be a really cool logo behind there that's not showing up. Anyway, I think it's cool. As there in our nice introduction there, my name's Mark Sterling, and my talk tonight is called Nuts and Bolts and New Tools. I'll get to that in a minute. Before I dive into that, though, I thought it would be useful to tell you a little bit about me and what I do, because you people are, many of you anyway, as students are going to be thinking about what you might get involved with in the future, and I have a fairly particular kind of experience that I hope will be useful for you to have a look at. That's me. I've got a lot of letters after my name. I'm an architect, and I'm a professional planner, so hopefully I'm talking to the right people here today. In parallel to my role as the director of Master of Urban Design program here at Daniels, I run a massive one-person urban design and planning consulting firm called Acronym. Through my practice, I work with many local and international architects, planners, engineers, and developers on projects that are proceeding through what turns out to be in Toronto a very complex municipal approvals process. And a long time ago, probably before most of you were born, I was also the Director of Architecture and Urban Design for the former City of Toronto. Although most of my work is with the private sector, I'll just show you a few things as I try to go through here. Although most of my work is with private sector mixed use and residential intensification projects, I also work with universities, such as the University of Toronto, Trinity College here at the university, and Victoria University. And I'm also working with OCAD University on master plans as well as specific development proposals. I've also led very large-scale public sector urban planning processes, such as the urban design components of the West Don Lands, Public Realm Master Plan, and the Lawrence Heights Revitalization Plan, both of which considered large-scale urban design and planning questions and translated responses to those questions into detailed official plan and zoning instruments. And so that's going to give you a little bit of a hint that I'm going to talk about some of the nuts and bolts of how you do those sorts of things this afternoon. I'll just also say, to give you an idea about what an urban designer does, here's what I worked on in the past week. In addition to trying to put this talk together, and I'm a very slow writer, so this took a lot of time, and meeting with thesis students of mine here at Daniels. I'm working on completing 2 planning rationale reports that accompany zoning bylaw amendment applications for 2 university buildings. One is a new residence and academic building for Trinity College here at the university, for which we haven't yet selected the architects. And I'm also working with OCAD University on a new proposal that's being designed on the campus by Morphosis and Teeple Architects. So both of those projects require a rezoning in order to get up and running in the City of Toronto. As part of that process, I'm also advising, and I met with this week, Trinity College on the architect selection process that we're just initiating, so we get involved in projects like that. I'm also working and met with this week developers of a new project for a residential building that's being designed by the Danish architects 3XN here in Toronto. And I spent a whole afternoon in Mississauga, which is great, as a member of the Urban Design Advisory Panel, where we looked at both a new public realm master plan for the city center in Mississauga, and we reviewed a design proposal for a new residential building at the Port Credit GO station. And after that, I spent the last 2 days at the LPAT, which you know is the replacement for the OMB, in a mediation session where we were looking at what they call a block plan for about 3 or 4 separate properties at Bay and Bloor Street. So I get involved in a lot of different things. So I would say being an urban designer is actually a pretty good way to keep your mind active, because I very rarely work on the same thing for more than about an hour at a time. So you can look forward to that if that's something you want to pursue. I've been here through other parts of the program, and I can tell you that the future city builders in attendance, all of you, are getting some very interesting ideas about our city's future out into the world. And I know that you're going to be moving after this into a charrette, which will, I think, also be very interesting to see the results of. Because you're looking at ways to accommodate new density in our city and tackling some questions that are of particular interest to me, those related to aging in the city, since that's what I'm doing. I'm aging in this city right now. I saw that great chart earlier on. I'm in the light gray area just below that really long blue 65 to 70 stripe. So I'm very interested in the kind of conversations we had there. I really like that idea of the golden, what they call it, the golden generation, or I'm in for that. Sign me up pretty soon. Because I'm part of this soon-to-be senior set, and because my professional experience implicates me very directly in the creation of certain aspects of the city that you're about to inherit, I'm somewhat hesitant to provide you with a lot of advice about the future. But that's what the organizers of this event have asked me to do. Let me see if I think I'm losing track of my slides here. Oops. Just give you a few more pictures of things I've been working on. That's the 3XN project. This is some interesting speculations about future zoning outcomes on various projects that I've been working on in the city. So the organizers have asked me to give you some advice about how to think about working in this growing and intensifying city. I'm following last year's keynotes delivered by Gil Penalosa from 880 Cities, who we also had another representative from here, and my colleague here at Daniels, Fadi Massoud, both of whom spoke very eloquently about their understanding of the many challenges facing our cities in the future and the need for new and sometimes old ideas about how to face those challenges. Let's see what my next slide looks like. Nope, don't go there yet. This talk isn't going to be explicitly about climate change, resiliency, social inequality, heritage preservation, or affordable housing, or, as we heard about today, the need for political renewal, all of which are pressing issues that need to be addressed, and I would argue are implicit in the more detailed planning and design concerns I want to talk about today. This talk is going to be, among other things, a kind of bibliography. I'll provide you with a kind of bibliography of new and old documents and projects that are, in my opinion, crucial for both understanding the current processes of city building in Toronto and the surrounding area, and imagining new and better ways to proceed into the future. I'm going to focus this talk on the infill of the existing city rather than the large-scale, comprehensively planned areas of the city, such as our waterfront, which I would argue we know well how to plan, notwithstanding, now I get to this slide, notwithstanding the ongoing debate about the sidewalk labs, Quayside, and Portlands. These are potential issues for another talk, and I encourage you all to sort of dig into what's going on in that area. So I've structured this talk in 2 parts, called it Nuts and Bolts and New Tools. I'm going to start with the nuts and bolts part of it. There's the sign. Because, as I said earlier, I'm implicated in the city we've recently built, I feel that it's important to talk a bit about where we are in city building and how we got here. And again, I'm talking about basically in the older parts of the infill parts of the city of Toronto. By here, I mean Toronto and Greater Hamilton area, which we call the GTA in general, City of Toronto in particular, and as the center and driver of that area in many respects. By here, I also mean a city that's highly urban in the best sense of what that term implies, walkable, diverse, amenable, if not necessarily beautiful, and at the same time is profoundly suburban, in that despite being walkable in many parts of the city, a majority of trips are made in cars by choice, for sure, and also of necessity where we can't really deliver transit. This is a situation that's well documented by David Gordon, for instance, and Mark Jansen's work. Somehow I'll have to give you all my references at the end of this. Maybe I'll post them somewhere. Here we have a city whose population is growing at a very rapid rate. We've heard a bit about that today. It's also a city in which we have housing affordability crisis. I'm going to quote from the Canadian Urban Institute's 24 key indicators for Toronto's housing market, which was published this past month. Toronto's population is expected to hit 3.9 million people by 2041. This means that over the next 20 years, the city's population growth will double from what it's experienced since 2006. They go on to say, without government intervention and action across the housing continuum, Toronto's low and moderate income households face a grim housing situation. They conclude that, unremediated, the housing situation in Toronto will produce consequential challenges for equality, cohesion, and economic prosperity in the city. And we've already heard a little bit about David Helchansky's work earlier in the previous panel in this area. Because this is a gathering of future designers and planners, I feel it's important to be able to talk about the nuts and bolts of our city building process. Planners in the room, and there are many of them here, will understand some of the significance of this. To the designers in the room, I'll offer a piece of advice that I've given to all of the designers who have worked with me in my architecture, urban design, and planning practice over the years. If you don't, can you hear me? If you don't understand, just when I was getting to my nice quote here, if you don't understand planning and zoning, they'll just happen to you. So I think it's very important to get especially for designers, to get a sense of the role that policy and regulation play in relation to the designs that you're going to be pursuing in your various professional careers. So I'm going to start with our official plan. Again, the planners in the room will understand that at the municipal level, the primary planning document in the cities is the city's official plan. Official plan is a policy document that can include more detailed secondary plans, which are focused on specific areas of the city, and tertiary plans, which are even more detailed, as well as a range of site and area-specific policies. Zoning bylaws are another important planning instrument. They're a set of regulations that are intended to be detailed implementations of the policies of an official plan. I would say to you right now, in Toronto in 2019, we are working with an official plan, which is really a scaled-up version of the City Plan 1992. So think about that. A plan whose process started in earnest in the late 1980s, roughly 30 years ago. So we're, in my opinion, and this is really key to what I want to talk about today, we're working with what is basically a very old official plan that's kind of had air pumped into it to get it up to the scale of the megacity that we inherited. The pre-amalgamation plan, that's that 1992 plan, was focused on developing a more calibrated understanding of the relationship between policy and eventually zoning and the very particular built form and typologies that characterized the former city of Toronto. Its development generated a number of important background studies, such as the famous Bosselman study that gets quoted a lot in discussions about pedestrian amenity and comfort in the city. It also included, here's some slides from that talked about ways in which we can look at sunlight access, pedestrian comfort in a public realm. It also included very important work done by Brown and Story architects, and we'll talk a little bit about more later, in their Open Spaces of Toronto, a classification. These are some of the images from that, and I encourage you all to go back and look at this work because it actually prefigures much of the kind of more current documents that we see being used in the city today. You heard a little bit about this before. During this period, we also saw a whole bunch of parallel and important parallel planning and conceptual planning ideas operating. You heard a little bit about the watershed planning work that was done by David Crombie, and this is a report that was that came out roughly at the same time as the '92 plan called Regeneration, which was the theoretical underpinnings of that watershed approach to planning. This was also the time period during which the very first looks at what became the West Don lands and now is called the Canary District, called the Ataratiri plan. This is an early version of that here. And this was also around the same time that the project for the demolition of the eastern leg of the Gardner Expressway east of the Don Valley came about. It was implemented just after that in the early 2000s. The plan at this time was an urban design-based plan built on the foundations set out in the seminal work done by George Baird, Stephen McLaughlin, and many others in a document called On Building Downtown, all one word. In my list, that's an important one that you go back and look at because it's kind of like the document for every design guideline that's been produced since, even if many of them don't recognize that that's where the conceptual frameworks for those things began. Those design guidelines on building downtown were part of a core area plan of the mid-1970s, which itself grew out of a growing concerns about development that found their voice in the reform councils of the mid-1970s. So not only is the plan from the late 1980s, but it's really the working out of a whole bunch of conceptual underpinnings from the mid-1970s. So think about that a little bit. City Plan 91, as it was known at that time, was a plan for 2.28 million people in the kind of same and a comparable area to that 3.9 million figure that we just talked about. At the time, we thought the city was growing at a pretty rapid rate. So that's what produced the need to try and recalibrate the official plan and the zoning bylaws that followed at that time. Almost immediately after this, we had an economic downturn, which all of a sudden created a whole series of new kinds of questions. And one of the questions that was sort of seminal for let's say the end of planning in the former city of Toronto before amalgamation was work that was done in King Parliament and King Spadina, areas which were on the shoulders of downtown, where there was a big problem with potential demolition, at least in part driven by restrictive zoning bylaws in the area. The plans that were put in place at that time, this was so let's call it 1995, 96, 97, so following on from that, during that downturn, produced a kind of deregulation exercise for the area, which was intended to incentivize really a mixed-use future for those areas. And it was accompanied by new planning policies and new zoning that were very explicitly set up to be calibrated directly with the scale of the kind of buildings that were anticipated at that time. What's interesting, again, to me anyway, because I was there kind of around this time, was that at the same time the Kings were being formulated, another idea which turns out to be very crucial in our current official plan sort of bubbled up to the surface. And this is a concept that we could look at the future of the city through what were referred to at the time as 3 lenses. Those lenses being areas of change, brownfields, and stable areas. And this came about as a kind of a moment rethinking about what the future of the city ought to be, and it was meant to be a translation beyond the, let's say, the growth-driven version of the 92 plan to something which was more reflective and focused on trying to make the right things happen in the right places. This was also a period where we saw the creation of the real, the first time we see the creation of citywide guidelines, urban design guidelines of any sort. So this all happens kind of in that same moment, after the 92 plan, but before the amalgamation, which is presaged by this slide. So this is the old Toronto you can see up there, and you can see the former municipalities around it. Those were all amalgamated at the same time as Jason was mentioning in the previous panel by the provincial government. We invented a new municipal government and a new municipal structure, and we essentially eliminated a regional government layer on top of that. Very soon after this amalgamation took place, everybody came to the realization that we needed a new official plan because we needed a new zoning bylaw. The official plan that emerged out of what was a very tumultuous period of a kind of forced integration of different policies and different organizational structure was somewhat quickly prepared, as you might imagine. It was kind of an emergency all of a sudden. It was a process that was somewhat like the kind of processes we're seeing with the provincial government now. A proposition comes out, it's implemented, and then we figure out how to make it work. And that's a little bit about the kind of process that we went through in the making of the new official plan for what became to be called the megacity. What was really crucial in the scaling up of this new plan from the old plan was the expansion of this idea of the three lenses. In particular, the expansion of the area of the city that was considered to be part of the stable areas of the city. And I'll go back a slide or two here. For some reason I'm out of order on this, but if we go back to here, you can imagine where the old city of Toronto is, down in the sort of south and center of this. That same idea about stable residential neighborhoods, which was essentially applied to the kind of pre-war Edwardian, Victorian residential neighborhoods, was expanded to cover off all of the kind of modernist neighborhoods in the surrounding areas, and those are the areas that you can see in yellow and that are referred to as the yellow belt in some of the discussions. Now I'm going to have to try and catch up here, get back to where I was. The preparation of the new official plan for this megacity there we go. Okay. The preparation of this new official plan was taking place around the same time as big changes were happening at the provincial level. We started to see new provincial policy statements. We started to see new growth plans, new transit plans. Whole series of events take place at the same time that the City of Toronto is trying to kind of figure out where its boundaries are, what the scale of development ought to be, and how it relates to this idea of growth in the future. Sorry, I got ahead of myself here. So over the 20 years since amalgamation, in the absence of relevant zoning bylaw and official plan that's generally conceptual, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. What happened to my thing here? Right. So I'm going to say that the efficacy of the plans that we put together when we were starting to do the expansion of this previous plan into the new megacity plan really were driven by a number of different things. One was the provincial policies that were looking to put brakes on sprawl and focus future growth areas where existing and new investments in transit and other forms of infrastructure could be optimized in the face of new population growth projections like those I noted earlier in the talk. So we went from a period of we thought the city was growing, we thought the city was shrinking, and then we went to a period of amalgamation, and then we went through a realization that we really are going to see growth in population at a very rapid rate. The efficacy of these new provincial policies and the responses to them by municipalities is under intense debate today. But it's clear that they resulted in intensification of the built-up areas of the city, and in particular the downtown core and central waterfront of the City of Toronto. Over the 20 years since amalgamation, in the absence of relevant zoning bylaw and an official plan, in the absence of changes to make our zoning bylaw relevant, and with an official plan that is generally conceptual, that is to say it's without specific standards, planning in Toronto and other GTH municipalities, I would argue, has employed an ever-increasing number of design guidelines as the primary vessels for thought and aspirations for the form of the future of the city, and an ever-shifting, unwritten set of new standards based on periodic surveys of amendments and variances. So I'm starting to talk a little bit about how we actually work now in the City of Toronto. Building on the intention of the 1990s general guideline that I mentioned, a collection of more specific guidelines from some area-specific and some citywide in application have been developed to elaborate on the general policies of the official plan. A quick sample of the City of Toronto's website shows the range of guidelines that have been created and indicates the extent of well-intentioned time and effort that's gone into their creation. I would argue in order to fill the gap left between those policies and the generally irrelevant zoning bylaw that's emerged over time. These guidelines, documents have taken over an ever-increasing specificity and often contain very prescriptive language using the auxiliary verbs shall over should or may, which would indicate flexibility in interpretation of the recommendations contained in these guidelines. It's been my experience that in many cases the interpretation by municipal planning staff of the recommendations contained in these guidelines is to treat them as if they were regulations rather than recommendations. And many of these guidelines are based on or imply idealized site configurations. So also over this period of 20 years, so since amalgamation to now, during which time we've been working on and bolstering this official plan that we have, it's over this period that we've seen a growth in the number of appeals of council decisions, or the lack thereof, to the provincial appeals body, which is the OMB, and now called LPAT. The appeals body has effectively become the main forum for debate, I would argue, about the future form of the city, with almost every new building proposed or built in downtown having been the subject of an appeal. It's also my experience that a large amount of time spent in the appeals process itself and the lengthy time period spent negotiating with city planning staff and local councillors leading up to it is focused on the interpretation of the intent of many of these guidelines and the gaps in policy that they intend to fill with the interpretation of the products of the various public consultation processes that take place. The negotiation that goes on in getting projects built or approved in the City of Toronto is protracted and centers mainly, in my experience, on the potential form of new, mostly tall buildings in areas where there's strong difference between what is permitted and what is being proposed, has been built over the last 20-year period that I'm discussing. So here's an interesting image right here on the screen from a group called Ratio City, who have been showing, basically visualizing the existing height limits of the city relative to the buildings that have been built. So you can see, I'll point to the Kings in particular, this sort of area over here, where even with a relatively complete and relatively new zoning regime, most, if not every building, most I would say probably every building that's been built in that area is actually taller than the height limits that were put out 20 years ago. So I think that's an interesting thing to look at. At the same time, because of the protracted period that is involved in getting things approved in Toronto, many now go into an LPAT process called mediation. As I mentioned, I've been involved in a couple of those, even one this week, in which negotiation is focused on looking at alternative outcomes that promote mutual interests. It's not a highly public process, but it's a kind of mirror of one, and it's kind of done in an emergency right before people go and basically shoot at each other in a contested hearing. If you take a look at a recent overview of Toronto's downtown, you'll see virtually no building built in the last 20 years of any size that did not require a rezoning. So to me, that's a very interesting point to make, that our zoning really doesn't tell us much about the future form of the city. Usually the rezonings are for height and density. Typically the densities and heights that we're seeing in actually approved and built buildings in these areas are 3 to 4 times what the zoning documents that we have that are current would permit. So I think that's a problem. You'll also, in a view like this, you'll be very hard pressed to find buildings in the downtown that meet the specifics of the various guideline documents that we're now relying on as our primary planning documents, given that our zoning really doesn't function well. I would say, in my opinion, that we're not planning very well for the unprecedented growth that the city is experiencing. And in fact, I would say we're not even planning for the city that we're building. And yet, we're still doing a lot of planning. So I think this is a challenge for us as planners, as designers. Much of this recent planning involves treating the official plan and the related guidelines as if they're zoning bylaws, uploading guideline content based on idealized site configurations as detailed metrics. In my opinion, we can't figure out how to create appropriate zoning regulations for the city we're building. What we have here now is really an emerging city that's growing according to an informal, negotiated, and essentially market-driven pattern. Our city's emergent structure is difficult for our inherited assumptions and techniques in planning to deal with, and it's more often than not considered by planners and the public alike to be a city that's characterized as many of each things, but nothing in its place. And what does this mean for us as designers and planners, particularly those of us who are young and about to enter the fray, and that's not me, obviously? I recommend that you have a look at a couple of things, and I'm getting close to the end here. I would say a key thing, what we most of all need is new tools, new planning instruments, new analytical techniques of looking at what's been happening, and new ways of looking forward to the future without necessarily needing to predict it. In my opinion, we need a new 21st century official plan, one which starts with a set of new first principles that recognize the real place of growth in the city and our ability to respond effectively to this growth within current planning frameworks. This new plan needs to be a document that looks forward, in contrast to the essentially retrospective and reactive approach which is operative today. Even TO Core, the most comprehensive update of the plan to date, works this way, despite having produced a large amount of valuable and interesting background studies. I'm showing here the work on alternative means of representing the city structure, which I was involved with colleagues at ETH Zurich and with a very smart Bachelor of Architectural Studies graduate from our program, Sabrina Yuen, based on some plans that were drawn in the 1940s as part of the London Central Plan. And this is an example of one of the 40 cities that were drawn in this way. I'd encourage you to take a look at this at some point. It's called potato plans. I believe we also need to reconsider the role of zoning regulations as tools for city building. we have the ability to use innovative approaches such as development permit system, which I won't go into in detail here, but I encourage you to investigate. Performance-based zoning is another thing that we need to look at. And that's something that I think is also worth taking a good long look at. If I'm thinking ahead about where work like this takes students like you and others who are pursuing interesting work, I'd have you take a look at a recently published article by Jana Levitt and Drew Adams in this month's Azure magazine that talks about more effectively combating climate change through zoning. So I think that's another reason why we need to look closely at zoning. In the alternative, maybe what we should be examining is whether we need zoning at all. And except in many parts of the cities, that negotiation is the actual process that we're using. Mediation, as I mentioned before, is a potential model for a structure of looking at the city like that. I want to point towards some work that's being done by some interesting people that I think, again, suggests a little bit about how this new way of looking at things might take place. This is some work by a thesis student that David Lieberman and I supervised last year, Maxine Cudlip, who was looking at ways in which local communities could act as collective developers of their own lands. And she looked in particular at Little Portugal in the West End of Toronto, and looked at a variety of different alternatives to conventional planning to look at ways at both creating environmentally sustainable neighborhoods, but also dealing with the intensification pressures that are currently being felt there. Somehow I missed one here. And I'll also show you another one that a thesis student whose work I reviewed in Waterloo last week, or in Cambridge last week, on new ways about thinking about development on the city's avenues. He talked about a very interesting, comprehensive way of thinking about both land assembly processes and zoning and official plan policies. It's an architecture thesis, so that's pretty good. I'll also point you to some very interesting work being done by some colleagues of mine here, James Brown and Kim Story, who are actually teaching a studio on this called the Un-Avenues. So if you know about the avenues, this is called the Un-Avenues, which is really an idea about looking for other big streets that could be the focus of growth and redevelopment over time in the city. And they were very nice to provide these to me because they're still working on this as a kind of conceptual project. I'd also point you to some very interesting recent writings on the city, on the country really, and on cities in general. I point you to Doug Saunders' Maximum Canada and Arrival Cities. And I think for planners, looking at this book, Maximum Canada, is quite interesting because he's really saying that we need to grow at an even faster rate than we're currently growing. And what I would like you all to think about is what does Maximum Canada look like when it becomes Maximum Toronto? Because I think that's another thing that we need to think about as we go forward in thinking about the future. Another project that I think is worth looking at as a way of understanding how our cities work is work done by Jonathan Massey and Brett Snyder, published recently in Places magazine, looking at what they called a mashed up street protest, social media and direct democracy, advancing a new form of open source urbanism in the Occupy Wall Street process in Zuccotti Square in New York. Very, very interesting look at the pressures that resulted in the form of the actual Occupy space in Zuccotti Park. I'm going to go quickly because I'm talking too long, but I'll just show you a couple of other things which I think are also could be the source for other ways of looking at zoning and policy and how to construct them. This is some work that's done by Cohen Pedersen Fox through their urban interface initiatives. I think it's a very interesting way of looking at performance zoning as a way of determining built form in a complex urban environment. You heard a little bit about this before. I think it's really important for you to look at this question of the yellow belt, which of course is the mapping. This is mapping that you'll see in the work of Gil Meslin, Sean Galbraith, Alex Bezikovic, and Sean McAuliffe, among many others, have been talking a lot about the need to kind of tackle this question about what to do with these areas which we currently say shouldn't change. And I think that's an area that all of you should be thinking about very soon. Closing up, I'm just about done. I'm just going to point you to, I was going to attempt to try and make links to the internet while I'm here, but I don't think I'll do that. I'd point you to two really interesting and important recent new organizations in the city. We take a look at the Ryerson's City Building Institute, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. Published just recently two really excellent studies, one called Rethinking the Tower from this past month, and Finding the Missing Middle from last fall. I think if you take a look at those, I think you're going to find a lot of hints about where it is we can go in the future, thinking about how to make cities. And of course, I think we are also looking forward to the developments that will come from the newly formed University of Toronto School of Cities. So that's a big blurt out. It's a lot of stuff. I'm going to leave you with about the interview in the Boston Globe in 1969. Face the fact, the old formulas no longer apply. And I'm going to leave you with two more. The last one, or the second last one, is Steve Jobs has been quoted as saying, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. So I think that's something that, as planners, wrote a very interesting in the 1960s called You Have to Pay for the Public Life. And I think that's very much worth a read. It's a little bit about pop culture, but the underlying message is a really crucial one, especially on the heels of things that we heard about in some of the panel discussions today. I'll just leave you with this. This is one of my favorite cartoons about the city of Toronto. And it has the other thing that I often say about the city of Toronto. It's really hard to read, but up in the top there's a little plane flying.
A couple of issues that I think would be useful for the students to expand upon. When you spoke of the alternative of performance-based zoning, and perhaps another way of describing it might be a zoning based on the negotiation, mediation on a set of principles rather than either policy or regulation, the latter two of which have hamstrung us. And as you say, a highly problematic zoning bylaw, which I won't even go into. You know too well my criticism of that. But I think it would be useful, perhaps, if you could expand on the performance-based zoning. Yeah,
I did have a nice long quote about that in here that I skipped over because I thought I was running out of time. But I looked at. Well, I'll just read you this quote that comes from Cohen Pedersen Fox's research on this concept, and I think it kind of encapsulates the question. They say that performance-based zoning requires two components: a description of the goal and a set of standards that can be used to A, measure whether said goal is achieved, and B, to set impact thresholds to which individual properties must adhere. They go on to say that this stands in stark contrast with typical prescriptive zoning strategies where a stated goal exists without a paired, measurable input correlating with desired outcomes. Instead, a set of prescriptive rules is applied which very often do not directly relate to the desired outcome. So that's a bit of a dense kind of quote, but it's basically saying we need to know what it is we're trying to plan for, and we need to be able to understand to the extent that it's possible whether there are standards against which the performance of any project or proposition can be measured in terms of its success of achieving those things. And that's often, I find that that's often resisted in discussions about how to plan cities because of the complexity of actually testing these things. So you saw that very complex set of models, for instance, that were used in the KPF slide that I had. The argument has always been that it's too complex, it's too hard to find all of the impacts, measure them, and set standards for them. And I would argue at this point in time, with the kind of computer power we have and the access we have to analyze data, that we're actually at a point where we could do more complex thinking about the form of the city and the form of the elements within it as they relate to each other in a complex setting. Zoning as we practice it today is typically about making very, very simple regulations, which often don't capture any of the likely solutions. And I didn't get it across very clearly in my talk, I don't think, but I think that the kind of zoning that we have currently in the City of Toronto is mostly a kind of a cobbled together scrapbook of the old zoning bylaws from the old former municipalities, and we haven't found a way to modernize them to the point where they're actually relevant in almost any discussion about what ought to be done in the city. So I think not only do we have to fix that, but I think we have to reinvent the way we use zoning and maybe even what zoning is supposed to do.
Thank you. My question is about sort of the bit of the history of Toronto and some of the key projects that the city is looking to partake in, such as the Downtown Relief Line, the Finch West LRT, as well as a potential Shepherd East LRT in the future. And we always hear in the media that we need to get shovels in the ground for these types of projects because of the volume of growth that we're going to have. However, has the city been actively looking at zoning the corridors for these to actually be able to facilitate transit supportive growth that could accommodate such infrastructure expense, other than just doing a secondary plan, but actually an implementable zoning bylaw?
I would generally say no. I mean, there are efforts to do that. They're often well after the decisions about the form, number of stops, the engineering aspects of such a line are established. So, for instance, if you look at the new Eglinton line, the engineering for most of that was done long before the Eglinton Connects planning study was implemented, and it hints at zoning in the end, but it's still mostly at a secondary plan level. There's a general reluctance in the City of Toronto to create up-to-date zoning for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the increment between the new development and what's in the zoning generates cash for the city in the form of agreements for public benefits. So there's a kind of inherent problem with creating real zoning because it would effectively remove an increment, remove a mechanism by which the cities get money to do things. So that's why I think maybe we shouldn't have any zoning at that point. Everything should be a negotiation.
Thank you.
Hi there. So going back a bit to the idea of negotiation and mediation, I find those things that we should be doing, but at the same time have created this lengthy and expensive process for people that, affect the affordability of future developments. So is there some happy compromise here where you can still have those mediations but sort of streamline the process so that you're not facing those challenges in the same way?
I think there is, but it would have to come about as a part of a much more realistic look at how we're building the city. I would argue that many of the design guidelines that we're using And frankly, a lot of what's in the new bits of the official plan, like TO Core, as it's being rolled out, are about consolidating the way we wish we were doing things, as opposed to reacting or being calibrated to the way we were actually doing things. So that's why I think we need some kind of a new official plan. I'm not saying we should not plan for anything, but we do need to find a way to get to the real questions much more quickly if we're going to be able to respond to the need for new housing, for instance, in the city. And it might be something that's focused very much on housing. But as I mentioned in my talk, I was in a mediation session for the last 2 days on trying to kind of juggle a whole series of buildings that want to find themselves across a couple of properties right on top of the Bay subway station. And about halfway through the process, everybody kind of took a deep breath and said, I wish we could have had this discussion 2 years ago. And I wish we could have gotten all of the people who are going to have to negotiate their way into something that makes sense in the room with the doors locked, trying to bash out a solution before we went into or during the period we were in the usual stately process of submitting applications, getting preliminary reports, and all that kind of stuff. And could have gotten to a more direct discussion about what the issues and impacts and potentials of working together at a certain scale might have produced. So I don't think it's I don't have a very good answer about how we do this, but I do think we need to reinvent the planning process so that we have options to say when we get to something where one person is proposing something, the people next door aren't going to do anything for a while, but they still need to protect their rights. How do we get them together before somebody says, well, forget it, I'm just going to make my plan, send it in, and we'll see what happens? Because that's kind of the dynamic that comes about when there are complex issues. I do think that from a zoning perspective, the mechanism that we have available to us that we don't use is the development permit system, which we could adopt or adapt to situations like the one I'm discussing.
Hi. So just for context, I'm over here.
Here.
My background is in IoT design and human factors research. And I'm just curious, because in your talk, and in the previous panel, sidewalk was alluded to, and I know it's a big topic. But in terms of developing the analytics, the performance metrics, the new models of zoning that you're talking about, is there a way to learn from that, or maybe through citizen research, urban engagement, methods like that, sort of build up research that can help develop those kind of new models?
I actually think that's the only place we're going to get these new models from. I don't think the people that are in charge of planning the city right now are going to be able to reinvent their way of working. It's too entrenched. And again, I guess my advice to those of you who are not yet in the professions that are going into this is to think about ways in which exactly those kinds of bottom-up ideas about how to alter or change the system could be brought about. I mean, the sidewalk labs thing is something I'm not, like a lot of people, I'm not exactly sure the level to which we know what they're proposing to do yet.
Right.
I'm actually going to see them tomorrow as part of a sort of thing we're doing through the McLuhan Institute here. I would say that some of the things that came out of the recent kerfuffle about them investing in the LRT and all that did raise some questions for me. I mean, I'm like a lot of people. I think, as some people have mentioned in panels today, the government should be doing these things. The Queens Quay East LRT has been on the books for a long time. No government is planning on paying for that, in my lifetime anyway, that I can see of. So I guess the question becomes if a company like that is willing to spend the money that the government isn't willing to spend or isn't capable of spending, we need to figure out a way to react to that somehow besides I think, besides just seeing it as a kind of grab of a public piece of public infrastructure. And it may be that, I don't know. But I also know that there's nobody lined up to pay for that thing, and Portland's, even the stuff that's currently already planned in the precinct plan, say like for Villiers Island, can't make any sense without transit. So we have to think about those kinds of things. Thank you. Done? Done. Okay, well, thank you very much.